You know, before I begin this, I have to tell you, I will never forget this.
Video at 11.
Video at 11. You know, as time goes by, the resurrection story has become one of my favorite Bible stories. The more I think about it, the more I feel that it offers a powerful perspective of how we could choose to show up when we are challenged by a crisis, whether it be a change in circumstances that we have no control over, or whether we recognize that there's a change that we need to make for our own good. The Easter story of life and death and new life offers a process that we can follow to move ourselves from life to life, so to speak. So before we take a few moments and look at it, let's quickly review the Easter story. Holy Week starts with Palm Sunday, and it is the day in which the people of Jerusalem celebrated Jesus' return to the city. They hailed him as their Savior. He was to deliver them from the occupation by the Romans. In the first couple of days of Easter week, Jesus continues to heal and to teach. And on Tuesday, he's brought up in front of the Jewish leadership, who've decided that they've had enough of this upstart and that he has to go. And on what we call Maundy Thursday, Jesus gives thanks, shares a final meal, the Last Supper, with his disciples. He tells Judas to do what he needs to do quickly. He washes the feet of his disciples. He gives them a new commandment, that they love one another. After supper, they go to the Garden of Gethsemane. And as you might appreciate, Jesus is facing a moment of personal crisis. He asks his friends to stay awake with him. 3 times he asks. 3 times they fall asleep. He prays. He asks God to take this cup away from him, expressing his very human response that he does not want to have to endure the pain and suffering that he knows is ahead. He goes through his own internal struggle and finally resigns himself to the change, saying, "Not my will, but thine be done." Judas now comes to the garden. He leads a group of priests, of Pharisees, and of soldiers. And in a fit of anger, Simon Peter cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant, and Jesus heals the ear before allowing himself to be led away. But won't we be happy? The following day, he is tried 3 times by the religious Jewish leadership. He's tried 3 more times by the Roman leadership. And in all that time, he refuses to do anything that might save himself. After he is whipped, the people have the opportunity to save him and choose not to. Instead, they tell Pontius Pilate to release and free Barabbas, a common thief. Jesus is then crucified, along with 2 other criminals, he speaks words of forgiveness. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He offers words of encouragement to a fellow prisoner. Today you will be with me in paradise. He ensures that his mother will be taken care of. In agony, he asks God, why have you forsaken me? And finally, he complains of thirst. And with the words, it is finished, and into thy hands I commend my spirit, he dies. Jesus is taken to a nearby tomb, and on the 3rd day, it is discovered that the stone that covered the tomb has been rolled away, and Jesus is gone. That is the Easter story. Now, I know some of us will have difficulty believing the literal truth of especially the resurrection, and that's okay. What I do know is that we are energetic beings, and we're in our infancy of understanding what that means for us. And I believe anything is possible. However, regardless of whether we believe that Jesus literally rose from the dead or not, there are lessons that we can learn from how Jesus conducted himself in the last week of his life. He experienced adulation, betrayal, fear, pain, death, and resurrection. These lessons can help us as we go through our own Gethsemane experiences when we are facing challenges and changes that we may not be ready for. When our world as we know it has to change because of a health crisis, because of a loved one who dies, a relationship that ends, or a belief that's challenged. When it becomes clear that our old reality must change, we get to choose how we will show up to the change. And there are learnings in the Easter story that could guide us to a more graceful acceptance. Are you happy here? Very good. Whatever you want, provide a resource for us as we navigate from one life through the crisis and into the promise of a new life at the other end. So, what are some of the learnings that Jesus taught us that we might be able to apply? And how do they differ from how we would normally behave? Well, what's the very first thing that we normally do when we know something negative is going to happen? We try to fix it. We try to avoid it, and we try to change it. What did Jesus do? He went into prayer. He let go. Instead of trying to avert disaster, he went within and spent time instead strengthening and readying himself for the challenge ahead. Now let's be clear. Jesus sincerely did not want to go through the death on the cross. He did not want to go through this ordeal. He asked that the cup be taken from him, and on the cross he cried, "Why did you forsake me?" These are very real, very human reactions that all of us can relate to. But he had the willingness to release his attachment to the outcome. And that's where I, could take a lesson. How many of us would be willing to do what Jesus did and be willing to let go and let God. I would want to find a way out. I would want to bargain. I would want to find some way to make that challenge disappear and control the situation. So, first lesson, let go. Let God. Trust. Into God's hands we commend our spirit. Another behavior that we see in Jesus' example is his dignity and integrity as he stood alone in the face of hatred and anger. He suspended judgment. Imagine how it must have felt to have the very people you love laugh at you, jeer at you, call for your execution. In the face of that, Jesus remained steadfast, internally focused, powerful. Wouldn't it be more realistic for Jesus to be upset at the injustice of it all? To hold a grudge, to be justifiably angry? Of course it would. And if Jesus' worldview was that the world is a negative place, likely he would have behaved with antagonism. But his worldview is one of love. And instead of giving into hatred, he continued to love. So what can we learn? How do we react when we are falsely accused, when we are subject to one another's anger and betrayal? We normally react with righteous indignation, don't we? We try to show the other person that they are wrong, or try to explain our position, hoping that they will see how incorrect they are. Sometimes we fight back, thinking that if they hurt us, we should hurt them. An eye for an eye. Why didn't Jesus show anger? Why didn't he fight? If he could heal the ear of the high priest's servant, surely he could have escaped his destiny of agony and death. Instead, he did quite the opposite. He knew who he was, and he knew that the only relationship he had to be in integrity with was his own relationship with God. Again, a hint for us on how we choose to respond when we are personally challenged. It takes great strength, perhaps more strength, to stand alone with dignity in the face of other people's disappointment. So, Taylor, would you go sit down with mom for a minute? My arms are breaking. Oh, you want to go to Grandma? Grandma's in the back. Thank you for keeping me company. It's fine. What gives us the strength to stand in the face of betrayal? If we believe that all things work for the good, we have immense strength. At Unity, we teach that there is only one God. By whatever name each individual may have for God, love, the force, Father, Mother, Yahweh, Shiva, universal energy. If you watched Jeopardy on Friday night, you would know that this is called pantheism. It was an answer. We believe that the energy we call God is a creative and positive force for good, everywhere powerful, everywhere present. There is no place that God is not. That means that in every experience, no matter how contraindicated, God is at work and good will be the eventual result. Several years ago, we did a workshop called The Keys to the Kingdom. One of the very powerful affirmations that has stuck with me. This too is good. This too is God. This too is for me, and I demand to see the blessing in it. And this leads us to another and perhaps most controversial behavior that Jesus demonstrated and which we can learn from. The other F word, forgiveness. On the cross, Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." If the Roman soldiers and the Jewish leaders knew that by killing Jesus, they would play a vital role in ensuring that his message would live on, do you think they would have done what they did? Instead of martyrdom, maybe they would have just locked Jesus up in a prison. Or maybe they would have just ignored him and thought he'd go away. Who knows? Without the crucifixion, the teachings of Jesus may have faded into the background. Instead, Judas, Pilate, the Roman soldiers, the religious leaders, the disciples, all of the people involved who let Jesus down by their combined actions and inactions resulted in Jesus' death. And even though it seems like what they did or did not do is unforgivable, they played a major and necessary part in the unfolding of the Easter story. Sometimes there are unintended consequences from the actions of people who intend harm. Or as Joseph of the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat fame said, his brothers sold him into slavery. What man intended for harm, God intended for good. When someone slights us or wrongs us, do we have a tendency to forgive as Jesus did? Not so much. Not so much. It is a human response to hold on to the wrong, to get caught up in the hurt and the betrayal and the mean intention. And it is a human response to want to retaliate. It is hard, so hard, to see beyond the appearance of injustice and to remember the truth that everything conspires for the good. And the people who are hurting us truly don't know what they are doing. By accepting that those who harmed us were playing a necessary role in our personal resurrection story, perhaps we can reframe the experience into something less polarized and negative for us. So, part of the resistance to that F word is how we define forgiveness. Let me be clear. I don't believe that forgiveness means forgetting. I don't believe that forgiveness means that we condone the other person's behavior. I don't believe that forgiving means that we even agree with the other person's behavior. It simply means letting go of the negative energy that we hold about the situation and declaring that we are not going to allow a past situation cause us pain in the present. I recently heard a story of 2 war veterans who had been imprisoned, and they met many years later at a memorial ceremony. And one of the veterans said to the other, "Have you forgiven our captors?" And the other replied, "I have never and I will never forgive them." To which the first man replied, "It sounds as if they still hold you captive." Holding on to hatred has been likened to holding onto a hot coal in your own hand with the intention of one day throwing it at the person who harmed you. In the meantime, you're getting burned. By refusing to let a situation in the past define our present, we have the opportunity to move from a state of victim to a state of victor. Forgiveness frees us to grow to our next greatest experience and is a fundamental part of our resurrection story. Another important aspect of the story is what psychologists today call closure. And I'll break it into 2 forms. First, Jesus fully felt his pain. "I thirst. Take this cup from me. Why have you forsaken me?" These are all gut-wrenching, undeniable cries of pain, emotionally and physically. In those words are yet another hint into how to transition from one reality to another. We must feel our feelings. We must acknowledge that they hurt. As a friend recently said, "It's one thing to know that this will turn out well in the end, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't hurt now." The grief that arises with an ending is very real. And even when we can acknowledge that the ending is necessary or inevitable, we do ourselves a disservice if we walk away without honoring the time that we spent in that situation with some deep reflection, some sadness for the death of that which is no longer, and hopefully with some gratitude for the learnings that we've experienced along the way. So part 1 of closure, experience and feel our feelings. Part 2, finish our unfinished business. Before he died from the cross, Jesus made sure that his mother would be taken care of. What I take from this is that before I can move on to a new reality, I need to finalize and put to bed my old reality. Those of us who have lost loved ones unexpectedly know the guilt and sadness of the unsaid or undone if-onlys. It can be powerfully healing to make sure that before we move to our next reality, whatever it might be, that we make peace with our old situation. If we have unsaid apologies to say, let us say them. If we have words to write that will bring peace, let us write them. Let us live with no regrets. Then, when we move on to our next experience, we can truly say, it is finished, and embrace the new experience fully. And so finally we come to the death of Jesus and the tomb. We die to the old way, the old belief, the old relationship, the old way of being, and move. The tomb, for me, represents the time for grieving and healing. The time in which, now that a new reality must emerge, we need to assimilate and find the place for the old so we can move forward freely to new greatness. Let me illustrate the tomb concept with a more familiar one, the butterfly. Caterpillars, before they are even hatched, contain imaginal discs. Awesome word, imaginal discs. They will never be used while the caterpillar is a caterpillar. Caterpillar eats and eats and eats and gets full and molts and gets full and molts again until finally it is time for him to transform. And when the time for transformation comes, caterpillars create a cocoon for themselves. And then they essentially die. Their old cells become kind of a soup. And the only thing that's left are these imaginal discs. The imaginal discs then multiply and slowly, slowly become wings, antenna, body, all the parts that make the new butterfly. So it can be with us too. It is in the cocoon, in the tomb, that the old is put away and the new beauty that has always been within us can emerge triumphant, more exciting, more lovely, more abundant than it could ever have imagined for itself. When we are faced with the Gethsemane, when we are faced with a crisis of relationship, of health, of faith, we have an opportunity to choose whether we are to be a victim or a victor. On the one hand, we can resist and fight and hold grudges and experience the crisis, kicking and screaming and angry, creating hell for ourselves and knowing we have to go through it anyway. Or we can follow the example that Jesus showed us. Do we trust that nothing and no one can be against us? Do we trust that despite the pain, there will be good on the other side of the experience? Do we forgive, recognizing that the people who we see as our enemies may very well be doing exactly what they should to catapult us to new good? Do we then willingly go through the storm, grieving for the death of the old, resetting what we believed we once were, and eagerly anticipating and embracing the new? Easter is our time for rolling back the stone of our old limited beliefs so we can emerge anew. That is resurrection. And we are all beautiful butterflies. Happy resurrection to you. Happy Easter.